welcome back to Victors Not Victims. 2 years ago, our family visited the new Smithsonian Museum of African American History on a trip to Washington, D.C. We went in looking forward to seeing a celebration of the Black experience in America. But unfortunately, the very first exhibit we encountered was a huge disappointment. 500 years ago, a new form of slavery transformed Africa, Europe, and the Americas. For the first time, people saw other human beings as commodities, things to be bought, sold, and exploited to make enormous profits. Was the European slave trade a new form of slavery? Was it the first time that people saw other human beings as commodities? Are these claims actually true? Well, that's what we'll explore in this first episode of The Real History of Black America.
The English term slavery originated with the Latin word Slav, meaning captive. The word slave becomes synonymous with the Slavonic tribes of Eastern Europe who had become enslaved through conquest in the 9th century by North Africans and Muslims. Lexico.com defines a slave as a person who is legal property of another and is forced to obey them. Too often we associate slavery with a black oppressed group and a white oppressor group, but that's simply not accurate. The truth is simple. Slavery has been an economic institution since the beginning of human civilization. It has been practiced by people of all races everywhere.
Slavery was not a strange new phenomenon for Africans when first brought into the New World. Slavery was very much a reality in Africa and was practiced in most of its ancient kingdoms and civilizations. So in what way had slavery been practiced on the African continent? Well, first of all, intertribal slavery ran rampant. As groups would come into conflict, it was normal for one group to enslave captives from the other group. However, the forms of slavery were numerous. Some slaves were treated as kinship and became part of the master's family lineage, while other slaves were used for human sacrifice. There is also evidence of tribes offering themselves up to slavery to avoid famine or conquest by warring tribes. There were also some tribes which did not practice slavery at all. So the experience and treatment of slaves in Africa depended on the society they lived in.
It seems that North Africans, specifically Arabs, were the first to enslave Africans by the masses in the form of chattel slavery, where people were treated as personal possessions to be bought and sold in the marketplace. They were equipped with access to waterways, such as the Nile River, fertile soil, and advancements, while southern Africa remained divided into scattered tribes. Arab traders supplied the Islamic Empire, China, and Europe with sub-Saharan African slaves. These slaves were either captured by raids or purchased from African tribal leaders, and these Arab traders became wealthy in return. Sadly, the Arabs practiced castration of male slaves, so as a result, they are unable to produce children. This trade, beginning in the 7th century, took place for over 700 years before the Europeans ever arrived in Africa. The Portuguese will arrive on Africa's west coast in 1441 in search of gold. The sailors gained permission to build a trading outpost that would export goods and slaves for hundreds of years.
African slave traders captured other Africans in war raids or by kidnapping and took them to the port, where they were exchanged for material goods such as guns, mirrors, knives, beads, and more, brought by boat from Europe. Historians John Thornton and Linda Haywood of Boston University have estimated that of the Africans captured and then sold as slaves to the New World in the Atlantic slave trade, around 90% were enslaved by fellow Africans who sold them to European traders. 90%. But were Africans the only people in history to be enslaved? Absolutely not. All people were at one point in time enslaved. In fact, the practice has been described and supported in many historical writings in the ancient world, such as Egypt, Sumer, Babylonia, and other parts of Mesopotamia.
Yeah, as Christians, we have learned the biblical account of Joseph, who was sold to Egyptian slave traders by his own brothers. Then, of course, there was the mass enslavement of the Hebrew people for 400 years by the Egyptians from approximately 1800 to 1400 years before Christ. Chattel slavery was prevalent amongst the Greeks and the Romans, as slaves provided the labor force for public buildings and the workings of mines and farms.
Between the 15th and 19th centuries, the Muslim Ottomans, the Barbary pirates, Crimean Tatars, and Turks enslaved roughly 15 million European, Russian, Mediterranean, and Caucasus whites. In fact, from 1500 to 1650, when transatlantic slaving was still in its infancy, more white Christian slaves were probably taken to Barbary than black African slaves to the Americas. The European captives endured horrible treatment and conditions, as men were generally branded and put to work in galleys or mines, not permitted to marry, and as stated before, castrated, while women were used as sex slaves. This is a historical fact that is not widely talked about in Western culture.
So, how did slavery come into the New World? Well, it never came because it was already here and thriving between the Native Americans. Early Europeans who came into contact with the Cherokee tribe described an indigenous institution they called slavery. In 1540, for example, the chroniclers of Hernando de Soto's expedition reported the presence of masters and slaves among the natives they encountered in what is now the southeastern United States. Sometimes chiefs gave the conquistadors their slaves for use by the Spaniards as burdeners or human mules. The Cherokee had a term in their native language which meant one who is owned. Slavery was nothing foreign to the Native Americans on this continent. Smithsonian curator and member of the Comanche tribe, Paul Chatt Smith, states that the 5 civilized tribes were deeply committed to slavery, established their own racialized black codes, immediately reestablished slavery when they arrived in Indian Territory, rebuilt their nation with slave labor, crushed slave rebellions, and enthusiastically sided with the Confederacy in the Civil War.
It is often stated that America enslaved Africans 400 years ago. But it is important to remember that America didn't exist in 1619, 400 years ago. The first African slaves arrived in Jamestown, a British settlement, in 1619. These slaves were taken from Angola and West Africa by the Portuguese and Spanish, and put aboard the San Juan Bautista, a Spanish slave ship bound for Mexico. The slave ship was attacked by 2 English privateers, the White Lion and the Treasurer. Privateers were legal pirates who raided, pillaged, and plundered without consequences because they were employed by their government. These privateers raided the San Juan Bautista, captured 50 to 60 Africans, and they were distributed throughout Virginia, including Jamestown. On another important note, these were not the first Africans on American soil. Africans first arrived here in the late 16th century, not just as slaves, but also as explorers, together with Spanish and Portuguese explorers. Estevanico, one of these African conquistadors, gained his freedom due to a shipwreck. He then went on to explore the land from Florida to Texas himself.
Roughly 12.5 million Africans were shipped to the New World. 10.7 million survived the deadly Middle Passage, disembarking in North America, the Caribbean, and South America. And out of those 10.7 million Africans, only about 388,000 were shipped directly to North America. The majority of enslaved Africans went to Brazil and the Caribbean. But these African slaves weren't being stolen or kidnapped by the evil white man. Initially, they were being sold into slavery by African chiefs and slave traders. In fact, white slave traders generally came to the African coast to purchase slaves who were captured and brought to them by other Africans. Henry Louis Gates, the Harvard Chair of African and African American Studies, stated that without complex business partnership between African elites and European traders and commercial agents, the slave trade to the New World would have been impossible, at least on the scale that it occurred.
So why has such a horrible practice like slavery persisted throughout human history? Well, slavery was and is an economic system and a way to gain wealth through forced labor. Owning slaves was often a sign of wealth. In many societies, if you didn't own slaves, you were looked down upon as lower class. Throughout history, many external factors, such as geography, wars, natural disasters, or plagues, had a tremendous impact on which people groups were the enslavers or the enslaved. The reason for slavery has always revolved around economics.
Again, slavery was simply a way for people to gain wealth. It often had nothing to do with the color of people's skin. Religion, tradition, age, disabilities, and social status were just likely to be a reason of one's enslavement, as was skin color. Seeing the slave as other was the key. How else would a person be able to justify this treatment of a fellow human being?
This need for justification was the true source of racist views about blacks being subhuman and was further fueled by Darwin's evolution theory, which claimed that blacks had not evolved as much as whites. Racist views and the idea of inferiority were used to reason between the practice of slavery and religion. Savagery of blacks justified the savagery of masters. Economics professor Thomas Thacker states in his phenomenal book titled Overcoming, "Whoever we exploit, we must see them as fundamentally different from ourselves. We can never acknowledge that they are people like us, for that would engage our moral instinct to treat them as we would wish to be treated."
So, we started with two claims. One, slavery in America was a new and unique form of slavery. And two, European slave traders were the first people in history to see other human beings as a commodity to be bought and sold. However, history shows a much different picture. The fact is, chattel slavery has been in existence since the ancient world. It was a system of labor created for economic purposes. At some point in time, every race on every continent has participated in this evil practice. This is simply reality.
And that wraps up our first episode of The Real History of Black America. We'd love to hear what you thought about the video, so leave your comments below. And in episode 2, we'll tackle slave ownership, the endurance of African slaves, and more. So keep an eye out for it in the days to come.
So like, share, subscribe, and click the notifications icon to get informed when our next video comes out.
Thanks for watching.